Hello, I'm Richard Wogman, and I'm going to be talking about friendly fire, Shakespeare's accidental enemies, and I'll explain what that means as I go on. I realize that some might consider the so-called anti-Stratfordians to be the enemies of Shakespeare, the author. As a Shakespeare authorship dissident myself, I will offer a different and possibly counterintuitive perspective on this topic. Namely, that it is actually mainstream Shakespeare scholars who inadvertently undermine our understanding of the author Shakespeare and prevent us from making vital connections between the works and their true author. Not enemies of the Shakespeare canon, of course, but unintentional enemies of our search for the truth about the author of the canon. A core, unexamined assumption of the traditional authorship theory is that early references to Shakespeare were indisputably references to Shakespeare of Stratford. Circular thinking and other manifestations of groupthink follow in the wake of this foundational assumption. A good place to begin might be with Stanley Wells, honorary president of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and since 2016, Sir Stanley Wells, in honor of his Shakespeare scholarship. In 2012, Wells claimed that, quote, Shakespeare was not all that learned. But evidence of Shakespeare's exceptional learning keeps mounting as past skepticism is being refuted with examples of his deep knowledge of many languages and subjects, a true Renaissance man. For example, the Arden series of dictionaries demonstrate Shakespeare's close familiarity with medicine, music, plants, religion, political and economic theory, and many other specialized subjects. A highlight of the series is Stuart Gillespie's 2016 Shakespeare's Books, an incomplete listing of some 200 writers whose works influenced Shakespeare. So I would suggest that Wells misspoke when he said Shakespeare was not all that learned, because he said it in the context of being interviewed for a 2012 documentary film called Last Will and Testament that supports the rival authorship claims of the Earl of Oxford. In addition to being a genius, Oxford had one of the best educations of his day, with scholars such as the great classicist Sir Thomas Smith as his personal tutors. He lived in Smith's household before entering Cambridge University at 8 years old. Perhaps Wells wanted to counter the authorship claims of such a well-educated Elizabethan writer by asserting the contrasting and appealing Stratfordian narrative of ascent from humble origins. Wells illustrates the tendency to dumb down Shakespeare so that the putative author, his ostensible education, and his life experience better fit the evidence. Last year, or this is now 2 years ago, a respected Shakespeare director in Washington, D.C., said Shakespeare erred in giving Bohemia a coastline. During the Q&A, I replied that Bohemia did have a coastline in the 14th century. The director then admitted, maybe Shakespeare was smarter than I thought. Precisely. As early as 1628, Thomas Vickers referred obliquely to, quote, that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear. You want to hear the original Latin? Celebrem illum poeta qui acquasatione ad hasta nomen habet. This circumlocution sounds very odd if the poet to which he referred were Shakespeare of Stratford. The other poets that Vickers lists in his book are all referred to by their actual names. The Stratfordian scholar Marcy North of Penn State indirectly raised further reasons to cast doubt on Shakespeare's claim to authoring the canon in her superb 2003 study of the prevalence of anonymous Elizabethan authorship Her book is called The Anonymous Renaissance. The stigma of print as a factor that inhibited the aristocracy from signing their names to the literary works has been challenged but not successfully refuted. Noble's use of an allonym, that is, the name of an actual other person, is illustrated by a surviving letter in which the Earl of Oxford instructs his literary secretary to ask Fulk Greville if Greville's initials could be signed to Essex's self-congratulatory account of Essex's role in the Battle of Cadiz to lend false objectivity to the self-glorifying narrative. Followers of the traditional authorship theory often believe their theory is 100% proven, with some open questions about co-authorship and about plays such as Edward III. Naturally, they question the motives of anyone who is skeptical about what they consider a fact, not a theory, as I've been told. I believe they are being unconsciously influenced by what has been called groupthink, a phenomenon of social psychology that promotes group cohesiveness by agreeing not to question unproven core assumptions. The in-group overrates its expertise, underrating the expertise of the designated out-group. Inductive reasoning was one of the many contributions of the Renaissance to our intellectual life. However, thinking becomes instead deductive for those who maintain an unquestioned premise that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, rather than following all the evidence and then reasoning inductively as to what authorship conclusions the evidence best supports. Confirmation bias is another source of cognitive distortion to which we are all vulnerable. Without realizing it, we selectively cherry-pick evidence favorable to our premises while paying less attention to contradictory evidence. Those who attempt to present evidence that is inconsistent with the group's foundational premise are often condemned with ad hominem attacks as snobs or conspiracy theorists, or as people who do not understand evidence, and still worse comparisons, rather than being offered an ad rem examination of the new evidence. Ad rem, the opposite of ad hominem, means you address the facts. A former president of the Shakespeare Association of America told me that all Shakespeare scholars get apoplectic over Oxfordians, such as myself, in order to maintain the position that, quote, no serious Shakespeare scholar questions that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Those who present evidence favorable to another authorship candidate are ipso facto deemed not to be serious scholars. In one case, the scholar's university officially asked him not to represent himself as a Shakespeare expert, despite his 90 publications on Shakespeare. We often think of the defense mechanism of projection as characteristic of psychosis, but neurotic projection is far more common. As I reflected on the criticisms often made against Shakespeare authorship skeptics, I eventually concluded that inadvertent projection may lie behind some, if not most of them. We are called elitists and snobs, ironically, by those who seem to resent the role of seemingly unqualified people who are not English professors in this debate. But Shakespeare belongs to all of us, and only became a university subject when English literature departments were formed, starting in the late 19th century. We are often told that the Earl of Oxford's death in 1604 proves that he died too soon to have written Shakespeare. But the traditional dating of Shakespeare's plays is based on a false chronology of the canon's creation, because it's based on the lifespan of the traditional author. So circular thinking may have created a false chronology of the canon. If the same author wrote the anonymous plays that are sources for some of Shakespeare's plays, then Shakespeare was born far too late to have written them. Another common line of argument is the assertion that the burden of proof rests with those who dispute the traditional authorship theory. If we pause to ponder this pseudo-legalistic logic, we are forced to conclude that it boils down to an assertion of an academic form of squatters' rights. The territory has been claimed by those who have occupied it the longest. In his 2012 book, The Truth About William Shakespeare, David Ellis of the University of Kent points out that we have insufficient evidence to write any sort of literary biography of Shakespeare of Stratford. Instead, this popular and profitable genre of biography substitutes legends, speculations, alleged biographical allusions in the plays and poems, and inferences from the historical context. Ellis warns that Shakespeare biographies are so inherently speculative that they actually damage the credibility of the very genre of biography itself. So, another example of Shakespeare scholars unwittingly being the enemy of what Ellis calls the truth about Shakespeare. We might wonder whether one reason for the recent revival of interest in Shakespeare's co-authors is to help explain the appearance in the plays of information that Shakespeare of Stratford would have had some difficulty in possessing. For example, detailed exploration of the phenomenal legal knowledge contained in the plays led to charges, spurious charges it turns out, that Shakespeare made many mistakes about the law. Similarly, the fact that so many plays are set in Italy created a search for ostensible errors in Shakespeare's local knowledge of places in Italy that appear in many of the plays. Once again, in both cases, an objective study shows there are no such errors. Power corrupts. We are less likely to arrive at the truth when partisans of one theory are in the vast majority in academia and declare challenges to the traditional authorship theory to be off limits. One publication invited me to review a book on Shakespeare. After receiving my review, the editor candidly told me they had made a mistake and would never publish anything by an Oxfordian. The co-editors of an Italian Shakespeare journal were replaced after they planned to publish an article I wrote at their request. Shakespeare belongs to us all. The universal appeal of Shakespeare's work is astounding. Across the centuries, across the globe, across age groups, across educational and socioeconomic divides. Shakespeare is performed by prison inmates in the United States and abroad. Political prisoners across the globe have spent their time in prison translating Shakespeare's sonnets into their native languages. Once English departments were established, they have tried to assert scholarly hegemony in the academic study of Shakespeare. Tolerance of diversity produces strength, whereas intolerance of diversity leads to weakness. That is as true when it comes to diverse opinions on Shakespeare's authorship as it is for other forms of cultural, religious, gender, and ethnic diversity. Arthur Meltzer's 2014 book on Philosophy Between the Lines, The Lost History of Esoteric Writing, suggests that we have underestimated many authors who employ it, including Shakespeare. Insisting that he was the relatively untutored son of Stratford means we are missing out on much of what he said between the lines. Covert commentary on court politics is a case in point. Polonius, named Corambus in the first quarto of Hamlet, was thought to spoof Lord Burleigh. That is, until Lord Burleigh's son-in-law was proposed as author of the canon in 1920, that son-in-law being the Earl of Oxford. Shakespeare scholars have since repudiated that rather transparent identification, once again acting as enemies of learning what Shakespeare was saying between the lines. Richard Dutton's 2016 book, Shakespeare, Court Dramatist, draws our attention to Shakespeare's court performances and how they influence his writing. Dutton challenges the conventional thinking that Shakespeare wrote primarily for commoners. He believes that Shakespeare revised the scripts written for court performances before the plays were staged at the Globe and other public theaters. Dutton is a scholar of the court revels. He must have noticed that the most commonly performed court playwright during the first decade after the Master of Revels was established was John Lilly, who was then employed as literary secretary of the Earl of Oxford. We do not know what sort of collaboration took place between the two men. Many instances of friendly fire undermine the traditional authorship theory, though that did not seem to be the scholar's intention. The University of Virginia's Gordon Braden has a special interest in Shakespeare and the classics. When I was researching the possibility that the translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses attributed to Arthur Golding might instead be the work of his adolescent nephew, the Earl of Oxford, some of Braden's comments on the work were encouraging. For example, Braden observed that Golding did not employ as many verbal doublets in his later translations from Latin. In the Ovid translation, though, quote, he often renders a single Latin word twice or more. He might have added that Hendiadys is typical of the later Shakespeare, and that the youthful Oxford may have been experimenting with what the 1589 Art of English Poesy calls, quote, the figure of twins. Braden also attributes youthful qualities to the Ovid translation. Quote, in a simple and naive way, Golding just wants to be easy to follow. The translator's attitude toward Ovid is said to be not sophisticated detachment, but a deep, naive intimidation. The translation is said to be, quote, full of moments of quietly spreading astonishment, and, quote, the quality of the astonishment is childlike. Golding was about 29 when the first 4 books of the translation were published. Oxford was a more childlike 15 years old. Braden even suggests that, quote, reading Golding, we can trace the beginnings of a particular poetic world that Shakespeare 20 years later would bring to its fullest development. Braden perceptively comments that Golding's approach in this translation, quote, indicates a way of looking at everything with interest, but no compulsion to interfere, a style of omniscience that sees all, knows all, and does not mind. We are in various ways close to the sensibility of the early Shakespeare comedies. Close quote. Golding's, quote, sense of humor that sometimes goes completely haywire. Sidney Lee said that the adolescent Oxford's, quote, perverse humor was a source of grave embarrassment, close quote, to his guardian, the future Lord Burleigh, his future father-in-law. In the introduction to his edition of the Golding Ovid, John Nims reflects on the flagrant paradox of the, quote, convinced Puritan who spent much of his life translating the sermons and commentaries of John Calvin, translating Ovid, the sophisticated darling of its dissolute society, the author of a scandalous handbook of seduction, that is, The Art of Love. Nims lingers on this paradox, calling it, quote, hardly less striking than the metamorphoses the work dealt with. L.P. Wilkinson writes, quote, Shakespeare draws on every book of the Golding Metamorphoses, and there is scarcely a play that shows no trace of its influence. Ezra Pound called this version of Ovid, quote, the most beautiful book in the English language, adding, my opinion, and I suspect it was Shakespeare's. Making allowances for Pound's hyperbole, who is more likely to have written the most beautiful book in the English language, Arthur Golding or the person we know as Shakespeare? It is a disappointment for me that Sigmund Freud could not persuade any of his followers to reread the canon based on the Oxfordian authorship theory that he endorsed. A. Bronson Feldman finally did so after Freud's death. Jan Scheffer in the Netherlands and I have continued that work. Other psychoanalysts who write about Shakespeare seem timid about disputing the Shakespeare scholars. Yet psychoanalysts of all people should know that there are always connections of one sort or another between a work of literature and its author. The imagination alone does not create great writing. It also needs to work on the raw materials of the author's life experiences. Great writers know this and describe their personal experiences with this synthesis. Literary critics made a major blunder when they followed the once fashionable practice of analyzing the text in complete isolation from the author. Naturally, I am no enemy of Shakespeare, but the 2013 book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, written in response to the film Anonymous, insinuated that followers of the Oxfordian authorship hypothesis, that is, the hypothesis that the Earl of Oxford wrote under the pen name Shakespeare, are ipso facto against Shakespeare. In that book, we are called anti-Shakespearean, even bardicidal. This may reflect an inability to empathize with those of us who find the evidence for the traditional authorship theory weak and unconvincing. On the back cover of a rejoinder book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt? ? That is the same title, but with that question mark added. I wrote, quote, "Authorities tell us there is no doubt that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Should we trust them? This book comes at a critical time, with defenders of orthodoxy deceiving the public about how weak their case really is. It is time for a serious re-examination of the evidence. This book does just that." Why do feelings become so impassioned when the authorship question arises? One possibility is that the Stratfordian theory is unconsciously faith-based at its core. For example, in 2016, the Folger Shakespeare Library tried to mark the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare of Stratford by eliminating the Shakespeare authorship controversy through taking to all 50 states first editions of Shakespeare's 1623 complete works, the so-called First Folio. Since the traditional authorship theory arguably rests on a foundation of mostly tradition, authority, confirmation bias, and groupthink, this tour resembled not so much objective scholarship as the medieval tradition of showing the alleged bones of saints or pieces of the true cross to increase faith. When the topic is sexism, racism, or colonialism, scholars are exemplary in their staunch support for social justice. When it comes to the Shakespeare authorship question, however, they seem to feel that different rules apply. They treat the authorship issue as their colonial territory, which they defend with militaristic zeal. Richmond Crinkly, former director of programs at the Folger Shakespeare Library, was dismayed by academic responses to Charlton Ogburn's influential book defending the Earl of Oxford's authorship claims. Crinkly wrote in the 1985 Shakespeare Quarterly, "Stratfordians and anti-Stratfordians should begin talking. A synergism between traditional and anti-Stratfordian thinking is highly desirable because the two have much to learn from each other. As one who found himself a contented agnostic Stratfordian at the Folger, I was enormously surprised at what can only be described as the viciousness anti-Stratfordian sentiments expressed by so many otherwise rational and courteous scholars. In its extreme form, the hatred of unorthodoxy was like some bizarre mutant racism. Crinkly did not believe that economic motives lie behind the zeal and intensity of traditionalists. He believes it had more to do with underlying quasi-religious impulses. And that's a quotation, or what I call the faith-based core of the traditional theory. In conclusion, I realize my take on Shakespeare's enemies is heretical, but I do wonder what sort of evidence it would take to convince Shakespeare scholars to re-examine their authorship premise.